Alright guys, we're going to talk about the perfect 03 Cobra setup. You've heard me talk about issues and problems with these cars that you shouldn't take to your tuner. Well, this car, this is Eric's 2004 Comp Orange Cobra, is the perfect example of how to set up an 03 Cobra for your tuner. So some people get confused and they think that, oh, I don't have a lot of money, I'm bringing you the best that I can. Well, it's not about money, it's about attention to detail and some respect for your car. Take the time to do it right. And I'm going to show you on this engine specifically what we're talking about, what we want to see show up at the tuning shop. So this car does not make 1,000,000 horsepower. This is a simple setup. Kidney Bell 2.8 return style fuel system, ID 1000 injectors on pump gas with a little bit of Torco. It's got a built NPR engine in it, so we know it was done right. It's got cams, some aggressive custom cams they put in there. So let's look at some of the things that you need to focus on. All right, first thing we're going to talk about is fuel rail pressure sensor. You guys love to delete this sensor. Not really sure why, but a return style fuel system doesn't mean we don't need that sensor anymore. That sensor gives us fuel pressure reading inside the car while we're doing a dyno pull, so we can see exactly what's happening with fuel pressure. If your fuel pumps have a problem, that's the first place we'll see it, because there's going to be a drop in pressure. If that sensor is not there, I have to make a total guess at what this engine is doing. Or you got to put some guy standing up here reading a manual gauge. This car doesn't even have one, doesn't need it anyway. But put some guy up here reading a gauge while we're making 6,000 RPM pulls at 150 miles an hour on a dyno. That's not exactly safe or smart. So keep the sensor, please. And also, if you have a return style fuel system, you want to make sure that the fuel pressure regulator has a vacuum line that ties in to the fuel rail pressure sensor and any boost or vacuum lines through the back of the engine. So while we're talking about the fuel system, let's talk about the return style fuel system that's on this car. This one's done good. It's got the fuel lines coming in the back of the fuel rails, one feeding each side of the rail, and then it comes out of the front of the rail and goes over to the regulator. This is the one from the other side. And that is the return line going back to the tank. And the reason I want to point that out is because the fuel can flow through the rails, so if there's any kind of debris in the rail, it can keep moving past the rails, get to the regulator, and get its way back to the tank to the filter again. There's a lot of cases where if it's a deadhead system, the fuel has nowhere to go but down the injector. So if there's any kind of trash that develops, gets past the filter, or if it's just where the internal fuel lines are coming apart, those little tiny fragments will end up on your injector and clog them up. All right, now let's talk about why it's so hard to get these cars to idle properly, especially with cams when they have issues. First one is air leaks. Big fat air leaks. They can come anywhere. You can have an air leak at the throttle body, you can have an air leak at the IEC gasket, you can have air leaks in the intake tube or this little cap, you could have air leaks at the gaskets underneath the blower, and especially the main one, where they're usually at, is these vacuum lines. You got to make sure you got good solid vacuum lines and connectors, no leaks, and make sure they're zip tied if they're not tight so they can't blow off. That's the number one source for leaking air. And leaking air is bad because the engine is sucking in air without the mass air meter knowing about it. This is the mass air meter, and this guy is the one that's responsible for measuring the amount of air going in the engine. So if there's some sort of an air leak anywhere else in this system that's not going through here, the tune's gonna be off. And this little guy is your idle air control valve. He's the one responsible for making sure that the car can idle properly, has the right amount of airflow going in through the intake. And if he's confused, you're gonna have a car that runs bad, or he's gonna stop working entirely, and then your tune is completely off. Next up is the intercooler pump. Make sure that your intercooler pump is circulating. Sometimes they get airlocked or stop working entirely. It's a mechanical object. Intercooler pump is down here underneath this fender area in the corner. This is the reservoir for it. You can check to make sure it's working by taking this lid off while the car is running to see if it's circulating. The water should be circulating rapidly inside the tank, and that's going to keep your intake air temperature cool enough for the blower to stay cool. If the pump stops working, then your IETs are going to go sky high. The car's going to run like crap. It's going to suck a bunch of power out of it, and you can actually melt down a motor simply because the intercooler pump isn't working. So make sure that's working, please. And always check your belt to make sure that it's tracking properly and not running off the edge of the pulleys. The big one is the crank pulley. Usually if you've done a 2-pound or a 4-pound lower pulley, can't see it in this photo, but it's down there. If you've done some sort of a pulley upgrade, a lot of times they can get off track, start shredding a belt, and then I'm on a dyno trying to make 7,000 RPM pulls, and the belt's shredding and flying off everywhere and losing boost. So the moral of this story is to take the time and build it right. It's not about how much money you have. I don't care if you have $100 in the car or $100,000 in the car. Keep it clean, do it right. Don't have wires draped everywhere, smelling like Burger King on the interior, and you got fuel leaks and oil leaks squirting out everywhere. Make the car clean. It doesn't take a lot of money. It just takes time and attention to detail. So, with all that said, let's start it up and see what it sounds like. All right, here we go. Let's turn the key and see what happens. Well, there you go. Perfect startup, Cam 03 Cobra.